Mark chapters 7 and 8 deal primarily with two major questions. Firstly, this kingdom movement that Jesus is setting up, does that extend beyond the family of Abraham? Question number one. Question number two, Jesus, from the very first verses of the Gospel of Mark, has been identified as the Son of God, participating in the setting up of the rule and the reign of the kingdom in ways that mirror the actions of Yahweh all throughout the Old Testament. So the question is, will the disciples finally come to terms with who Jesus really is and what Jesus is really doing through the kingdom? That's question number two. Mark chapters 7 and 8 in many ways are joined to the hip with Mark chapters 5 and 6. So if you'll recall from 5 and 6, we had this frame narrative between the two stormy sea scenes. And in between that is just scene after scene after scene where Mark is showing us that Jesus is taking up the personification, the actions of Yahweh in order to come to the people of God, to set up the kingdom in a new way, and to proclaim clearly that this Jesus is acting as the Son of God, partnered with the Holy Spirit. That's chapters 5 and 6. We get to chapter 7, and 7 and 8 act as a bit of a fulcrum point. Now we know from chapters 5 and 6 that Jesus is indeed the true king, the true Messiah of the family of Abraham, the Judeans who follow Yahweh. Chapter 7, we start a conversation on purity, and we ask that question, what about people who are not part of the temple religion, part of the family of Abraham, part of those first century Judeans who already follow Yahweh? What about them? Chapter 7 opens with another contentious scene. The Pharisees come and they're testing Jesus again. And so in verses 5 and 6, well, in verse 5 here of chapter 7, the Pharisees and legal experts, they come to him and they ask him a sort of trap question, again, to probe Jesus and to see what is really going on. They ask, why do your students, your 12 disciples, why do they not live according to the tradition of the elders? Why do they eat their loaves of bread with dirty hands? The Jewish tradition at that time, especially coming from places like Leviticus and the conversations around Leviticus, became really concerned with cleanliness, and especially around ritual cleanliness and the ways in which people ate their food, washed their cups, and during the Sabbath, the way they set up their homes, that sort of thing. And so Jesus responds again with a quote from Isaiah. Isaiah prophesied well about you hypocrites. It is written, the people honor me with the lips, but their minds are far from me. Their hearts are far from me. In vain they worship me with teachings, namely the commands of people. So then Jesus summarizes and drives the point home, chapter 7, verse 8. Abandoning the commandments of God, you seize and you hold on to the traditions of people. Again, this Mark and Jesus is not mincing words. He is using some challenging and forthright language. You hypocrites, you're abandoning the commandments of God. You're seizing the traditions of people. And this conversation is all about purity. How do we become ready to enter the presence of God? That's what the purity laws were all about for the first century Judeans. And again, Jesus is calling us to back up, to go deeper under those layers and say, hey, what is the heart condition telling us? So we continue, verse 9. You reject well the commandments of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and mother. Let the one who speaks evil of their father and mother be put to death. And then he goes on and says, but you guys do this, that, and the other thing. He says, well, you give any assistance you would give to your father and mother, and you essentially donate that to the temple as a tax deductible gift and say, well, mom and dad, sorry, I don't have anything to give you. I've given it as a gift to God. And so they use a loophole in order to get away from honoring your father and mother and taking care of them. Now that is a pretty sour accusation, but apparently this sort of thing was happening well enough for Jesus to be commenting on how the superficial interpretations, the legalistic mindset has also created margin, unintentionally perhaps at first, for people to create loopholes and to skirt around the good things and essentially abuse the law. In that way, the law makes room for us to do evil while pretending to do good. That is one of the bad side effects of the law that Paul then kind of picks up on that idea later in his writings. And so Jesus is really pushing hard back against this and the interpretations, the applications of these purity laws. And it's interesting that we're talking about food and that sort of thing. And the gospel author of Mark kind of pulls us aside and gives us little notes. Hey, this is kind of the way that the Judean peoples thought about this or that or the other thing. He's kind of interpreting for the audience in case that his audience wasn't familiar with Judean customs. So it's likely that Mark is speaking primarily to an audience that would have been either in Rome or in north of Israel, in like Samaria or Syria, that kind of thing, even Turkey, people who were not super familiar with these sorts of rules and regulations. And so then Jesus comes out and says something about the cleanliness. And he says, okay, you're upset that people aren't washing their hands because that makes them unclean in your eyes. But the stuff that goes into your mouth, that's not what makes you unclean, he says. Well, that your body just processes that and it goes out of your body. And it kind of, in Mark, feels like has a bit of maybe potty humor here that he's really not intending. What he's saying is, well, your body takes care of that. You're bound up in these physical ideas while missing the spiritual implications. Again, this is Jesus saying the physical matters when you get the spiritual underneath it correct. Then you've got those two inconsistency. So he says, the things that are inside of the human heart that come out of us, that is the true uncleanliness. That's truly what separates somebody from the presence of God. And so it's from within, from the mind, the heart, that is when evil designs come out, the thefts and the murders and the adulteries and greedy acts, evil acts, debauchery, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the evil stuff that we should be focusing on, not, hey, did you wash your hands before you eat? That kind of thing. And this is some contentious stuff for his day. Verse 24 is interesting. He transitions out of that. But also Mark pulls us aside and says, by saying these things, he made all foods clean. Again, a big contentious claim that all foods are clean for the kosher law. That goes out the window. I don't know. That seems to be what's happening here. And so Jesus is saying things like, what you thought was dirty, unclean, exempt from the presence of God, let's rethink that. This logic is what carries us into the region north of Judea to people who are not from the family of Abraham, like Tyre. On your map, go find Tyre. It is far north. This is a region of people who would not be likely followers of God. They are people who would not really go down to the temple and worship. There might be synagogues there, but by and large, these are not considered clean people in the eyes of your good law-following first-century Judeans. So he goes away to the district of Tyre. There's a couple different arguments here. Why is Jesus going there? One, maybe he just said a bunch of really blasphemous things and things are getting really heated. And so he's trying to get away until things calm down a little bit and then he'll come back. That could be it. It could be that he's going on vacation. He needs to rest. So he goes to Tyre. He enters a house. He doesn't want anyone to know. He wants to remain hidden. He wants to take some time to be in prayer, to rest, to relax. He's been busy. That could be it too. It could also be that he is preparing for the next part of his ministry in regions that are not of the area where people are following God, who are first century Judeans, people who are Gentiles, as they are called. That is Tyre. So that could be it. He's preparing for this next phase of his ministry. And so his cover's blown, and a woman, a Syrophoenician, who is an unclean person, whose daughter has an unclean spirit. That's what the Gentiles are called, like unclean people. They're often called dogs by first century Judeans. There's a lot of bad blood and bad history between these people groups. And so they're called dogs. They're seen as unclean. They're not fit for temple worship and that sort of thing. Syrophoenician woman comes to Jesus and has this need. And Jesus says something that is really jarring to our modern sensibilities. Let the children be fed first, because it's not good to take the children's loaf of bread and throw it to the pet dogs. That is some rude stuff coming from Jesus. So this Syrophoenician woman is coming, asking for help for her daughter, and she gets that in response. What on earth is going on here? This does not sound like the Jesus that we tend to talk about on a Sunday morning. And there's a couple different arguments. In fact, commentators have taken every direction with this scene. It could be that Jesus actually believed this. And he said, okay, well, you are just not worthy of the kingdom ministry. And so I'm going to tell you no. That is one argument people have put forward, that Jesus wasn't fully ready to minister to these people. And I would say, hey, that interpretation isn't consistent at all with what we see in the rest of the Gospel of Mark. Now, there could be another variation on that. There could be a sense in which Jesus is not saying no to the Syrophoenician woman. He's saying not yet. This is what Paul picks up on, the Jew first and then to the Gentile. This is Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, the call of Abraham. The reason that there's a nation of priests, Exodus 19, 1 through 6. The reason that Israel is a nation of priests is then to bless the other nations. That's the idea. The vehicle God is building in this people group is for the blessing of other nations. And so Jesus is saying, you will have the experience of the kingdom, but we have to wait patiently until God and the kingdom movement sorts Israel out, because Israel has been gone astray. We're sorting Israel out, and we're going to, in this new community of faith, we're going to see healing come in its right time. So maybe just not yet. It could be that that's what Jesus is saying. Or it might be that the disciples are there with Jesus. They're not mentioned in this story, but they often tend to be kind of lurking in the corner. Maybe the disciples are getting a lesson here, and maybe that there is some tones and some joking or a glint in Jesus' eye that doesn't really come through the text. Remember, the Gospel of Mark was written to be performed. There would be a person or a group of people that would go to a house church or to a town forum, and they would perform the Gospel of Mark for people who weren't able to read, and they would then be able to access the story through performing. So maybe this is a dramatic scene where Jesus is sort of giving us the line that we would expect from a good rabbi. This is exactly what you should say to a Syrophoenician woman is, hey, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile, that sort of thing. But maybe Jesus is sort of saying, like, let's see if the disciples are picking up the real way we should go. And so maybe there's some subtext here. That could be it as well. But regardless of any of those interpretations, what we do know is this woman persists. And she says in this act of humbleness for her daughter, hey, I know that the kingdom of God overflows. There's such goodness that it's going to overflow, and even the people around you are going to experience some sort of blessing. It's that powerful. And Jesus says, hey, go, your daughter is healed. So we've got this scene, start of chapter 7, a redefinition of purity. And then all of a sudden, the unclean people, like the Syrophoenician woman, have an experience of kingdom healing and get to experience new life as a result of the movement Jesus has. Okay, interesting. Maybe the redefinition of purity isn't just about hands. Maybe it's about people too. Who gets to be a part of the kingdom of God? Then we continue, and we see a section where he continues going through Gentile territory. This is verse 31. He ends up in the region of the Decapolis, which is where in chapter 5 we had the Gerasene demoniac. And so he's in Gentile territory, and we get an interesting scene where he has another feeding narrative for 4,000. And most people will think like, oh, feeding of the 4,000, we just had feeding of the 5,000. Why would Mark duplicate the stories? This is a different geography. These are Gentile people coming to Jesus, longing to be in this kingdom community. And he says, chapter 8, verse 2, I have compassion for the crowd. Again, Jesus in compassion. And he feeds them and he teaches them, and they become part of the kingdom community as well. This is a powerful a watershed moment where the kingdom gates are blown wide open. All of a sudden, we see that anyone who gets to be a part of the kingdom community, it's about what's on the inside, that heart condition, just like he was talking about in the beginning of chapter 7. That is what makes somebody clean or unclean, not their heritage, not their skin color, not their family of origins, etc. It is, are you willing to enter into the kingdom through obedience to the Lord? Okay, all of this has just happened. Now, we get to see, do the disciples pick up what Jesus is putting down? This is considered to be Peter's confession. And so Jesus asked them, who do you consider me to be? Verse 28 of chapter 8. John the Baptist? Elijah? He asks them, who do you think that I am? And so Peter, at last, Peter sees what's going on. You are the anointed one. You are the Christ. You are the Messiah. Thank goodness. Thank goodness, Peter. We can trust Peter to be on board. And then he says, okay, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen then. And so verse 31, he begins to teach them that it's necessary that he's going to suffer. He's going to be rejected. He's going to be killed. And then he's going to rise. He's telling them the whole future of Holy Week. He's letting them in on the playbook. And verse 32, he's saying all these things plainly, which is shocking because Jesus does not communicate plainly. He talks in parables and riddles and subtext. But here, he's speaking plainly. Peter takes him aside and rebukes Jesus. No, Jesus. You've got it all wrong. That's not what the Anointed One is all about. Okay, hold on. Jesus turns around, rebukes Peter. Get behind me, Satan. You're not thinking in God's terms. You're thinking in the terms of human beings. Again, Jesus has to go in and sort out what is the source of this intention. Peter is saying that is not what the Messiah does. The Messiah is this Davidic monarch who will overthrow Rome, who will set our people straight, who will bring us back into community with God, who will give us a secure nation. And Jesus has no intention of doing that military overthrow. Zero whatsoever. He says, no, I'm going to go and I'm going to get myself killed. And then I'm going to rise again. That is the mission of the Anointed One. Are you in? And Peter is not thinking that way at all. Jesus says, get behind me, Satan, because Satan is the true antagonist. Not get behind me, Peter. Peter is not the bad guy here. He's one who's gotten duped and seduced by the way that Satan would twist the things of God, like the Messiah. And so Jesus has to set them right as well. But it seems like Peter just isn't tracking along. And then right after this, we're going to go into chapters 9 and 10, and we're going to see, okay, now Jesus is going to reveal himself and his mission as we journey towards Jerusalem in a very plain way. Will they get it then? That's the question. That's what we're going to talk about in chapters 9 and 10 for next time.